of the center has been encouraging. They also hosted a roundtable on tourism sometime last year when we were marking something for World Tourism Day. They've also observed our conference in 2018, so we are grateful for your support. We are glad that we could put this webinar together in a short span of time. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce all our speakers, distinguished speakers. First and foremost, Mr. Simon Anholt. All of you may have heard of the term nation brand. He is the world's leading expert on the inventor of the term nation brand. He's also an independent policy advisor who for the last 2 decades has worked with heads of state and heads of government for over 56 nations to help them improve and enable their economic, political, and cultural engagements with the international community. But what I found fascinating of Simon, and that's how we got in touch, was in 2012, he created this Good Country Index, which measures the impact of each of the 163 countries that he has so assiduously put together and how they impact the larger humanity and planet. I'm so glad Simon could join. Right now, he's in Italy. Thank you so much. Next, we have who I fondly called as Ambassador Karl Erik. He's the founder and Secretary General of the European Cultural Parliament, the only pan-European forum for cultural personalities from all sectors of arts. The ECP, as it is called, has 160 members from 43 European countries. The ECP initiates projects and workshops on various European themes such as democracy, European cohesion, public diplomacy, media quality, etc. Ambassador has formerly served as a diplomat for 3 decades in Moscow, Peking, Geneva, and Rome. He has largely dealt with foreign policy, trade negotiations, cultural affairs, development cooperations, and humanitarian affairs at the United Nations. We have Dr. Wang, who will join us shortly. He's the scholar and consultant in the field of strategic communication and public diplomacy. He's a director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy and an associate professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He has written widely on the role of communication in contemporary process of globalization, with obviously an emphasis on soft power and public diplomacy. He's the co-editor of the newly published book, Debating Public Diplomacy, Now and Next. And finally, from the home ground, we have Mr. Ram Madhav. He's an Indian politician, author, and thinker who's currently serving as the National General Secretary of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Formerly, he was BJP, coincidentally, is the world's largest political party today. He also serves as a member of the governing board of India Foundation, our mother organization, which seeks to articulate Indian nationalistic perspective on issues of national and international importance. Of course, he's written several books in English and his native language of Telugu. Another very interesting facet is he's traveled to over 30 plus countries and consistently engaged with the media, intelligentsia, and the think tanks from these countries. He's also addressed several prestigious forums such as Shangri-La Dialogue, World Peace Conference at Thailand, and of course the Halifax Security Forum in Canada. Thank you to each and every one of you for joining today. What we would now start the panel with is, if I may request each of our distinguished speakers, and we can start with Ambassador Karl Erik, on the current role that he foresees public diplomacy will play from an economic, social, and geopolitical perspective in times of COVID-19. Once this segment is over, each speaker is given 10 minutes to present his views. After that, we would also discuss the future of public diplomacy for a few minutes each by the speakers. Then we go to Q&A. So Ambassador Karl Erik, on the present of public diplomacy in COVID-19 for about 10 minutes, please. If you can unmute yourself, sir. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Sudarshan, and thank you for inviting me to this web seminar. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I would say first that we have now since 2.5 months a completely new situation. Up until March 2020, the world was experiencing a hyper-globalization, for good and for bad. Well, for good, of course, it meant growth and open borders. For bad, it meant inequality to a large extent, and also a lot of ecological damage. It meant poverty, and it meant climate crisis. Because the more the globalization was successful, unfortunately, the ecological footprints became bigger and bigger. Up till March 2020, we had a tourism booming enormously. It had grown exponentially over the last decades, and it was more than 1.5 billion tourists out around the world, like last year or beginning of this year. There were permanently about 25,000 airplanes flying around in the skies. And as for public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, which is my specialty, it was really booming. We had events everywhere. We had festivals, a growing amount of festivals. There were people from the arts and music performing around the world. There were sports events, an increased number of sports events. There were a great interest in cultural tourism and also in health tourism. You in India will be aware of that, for instance. And there was, of course, a permanent increase in digital public diplomacy at the same time. What we had also experienced during the last decades was that the economic role of governments had been decreasing. The public sector was declining since around 1980. The last 4 decades with globalization, the role of the public sector was decreasing, whereas the private sector, the big international corporations and the finance markets were growing in importance. Exception were, of course, China and other authoritarian states where the liberal market economy was parallel with, or was in coalition, so to say, with the government. Now, by March 2020, governments seem to have taken back the initiative, together with scientists, mainly virologists. But extraordinary measures have been taken, and a lot of personal freedom has been lost. So that is the big paradigm shift that we are now experiencing. Up till now, or up till March, migration was a very big issue. That was, of course, part of the globalization procedure. Migration was a big issue in Western Europe and in Northern America. And populist parties, so-called right-wing populist parties, were profiting. There was political polarization, and not least in the social media. A lot of hate speech and so on in the social media due to the migration issue. The European Union, which is close to my heart, of course, has a relatively ambitious public diplomacy program. But it is more theoretical, I'm afraid to say. In implementation, it's rather weak because first, the EU does not have a real cultural mandate. And secondly, there is a lack of cultural competence at the European Union offices around the world. So in connection with this, European Union has been facing a credibility crisis even before Corona. We had the Brexit crisis, which is still going on. United Kingdom left the European Union on 31st of January 2020. So this crisis is still there because it has to be implemented. We have a north-south crisis within the European Union. It's mainly on economy. Who shall pay the bill, so to say? And we have an east-west conflict within the European Union, and that is mainly on migration. Who shall receive migrants and refugees, etc.? The east side of Europe is not in favor. The west side is more open. And now the Corona crisis might very well strengthen the EU crisis. So we have a multi-dimensional crisis in the European Union right now. What we have to ask ourselves, I think, is if the proportions are right. The coronavirus came to our knowledge around January, early February, and very radical, very drastic measures were taken. And we might ask ourselves if there are proportions here, because we are really locking down the whole world. The consequences for the poor are already enormous. We may ask ourselves if there are more victims from the lockdown than from the virus itself. So it's disastrous, of course, for restaurants, cafes, hotels, small business, air companies, and so on, and for the whole tourist industry, which is so important. It seems, on top of this, very close to our hearts in the European Cultural Parliament, we seem to be killing large parts of the cultural sector right now. We are, and we might also be leaving a lost generation of children who cannot go to school for let's say half a year or so. And many of these people are not digitally equipped enough in order to take digital tuition. So these are some of the big problems we have right now, which we are living in right now. And as for, let's say, possibilities and so on, I guess, Sudarshan, that I will leave this for the discussion, what we do after the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Karl. May I request Simon to share his thoughts on the present?
Thank you very much, Sudarshan, and thank you to you and all of your colleagues for the invitation to speak today at this forum. It's really a great honor. I suppose the question that I've been asked most often since this pandemic took hold is, what is this going to do to the rift between the globalists and the nationalists? Will it end up teaching us all to be more multilateral and more internationally minded? Or will it cause us all to turn inwards and become more and more nationalistic? And I'm afraid the answer is both, because of course, one of the characteristics of humanity in the 21st century is that we all seem to have lost the ability to change our minds about anything under any circumstances. And this is perhaps the greatest problem in the world today. We simply don't know how to change our minds anymore. And so I think it's an absolute certainty that all the people who were opposed to the idea of globalization before the pandemic will find their views reinforced. Because of course, arguably, they're right. If there was no globalization, then the epidemic wouldn't have become a pandemic. On the other hand, the people who are more internationally minded and more multilateralist in their tendencies, like me, will see in the pandemic more and more arguments for more multilateralism, not less. If we were all working together, if we were more collaborative and more cooperative, we'd probably have been able to knock this on its head fairly early on in the process. And in one way or another, this appears to be the blockage in the international system that we face. Pandemic or no pandemic, everything that seems to happen to us, every experience, just reinforces the prejudices that we're all succumbing to. I don't know why this should be. Myself, the older I get, the harder I find it to have an opinion about anything at all. And I used to worry about this. I rather admire people who have strong opinions. But I've begun to realize that actually not having an opinion about things can be, in certain circumstances, the best position to be in, because it can mean that you're beginning to understand that there are two sides at the very least to every single situation. And when you get to the stage where you can see every side of every situation, then you're approaching wisdom. It does make decision-making rather harder, but it makes your decisions more reliable once you make them. So I think that from my point of view, at any rate, there is absolutely no doubt that this pandemic has underlined really quite dramatically the essential necessity for humanity to change its culture. Traditionally, up until now, the culture of the international community, if we can call it that, was that nations were a series of warring independent tribes. Ever since the nation state was invented and long before, the purpose of a nation was to supersede other nations, to grab more for its own people, to do better. We configured the whole international community, the whole of life on Earth, as if it were a sprint to the finish, and the winner takes all. One of the things that's become more and more obvious as time goes on is that that's not what human existence is about. Human existence is a team sport, for the simple reason that we all share the same home, and the same planet, and the same environment, and the same space, and the same resources. So unless we can learn to change the fundamental culture of governance worldwide, from one that has traditionally been competitive to one that is fundamentally cooperative and collaborative, then we're doomed. Will coronavirus help us do this? Not without some help. We might be able to, those of us who believe in cooperation and collaboration and multilateralism, to use the example of coronavirus to demonstrate with perhaps more impact than it's been possible to demonstrate it up until now, how absolutely essential it is that countries do work together. I suppose the point that needs to be made, particularly to people of a more nationalist inclination, is that cooperation and collaboration are not the enemies of competition. They actually fit together very well. I don't have a problem with competition. Competition has lifted billions and billions of people out of poverty over the decades, as we know very well. Competition only becomes a problem when it's the only altar at which we worship. And that's been the way that the global economy has been run for the last 80 or 100 years. Wisdom, I think, consists in learning how to harmonize a number of things, how to harmonize competition and collaboration, which incidentally, industry started doing 30 or 40 years ago. Back in the 1970s, the automobile industry was full of the new idea of co-opetition, the idea that within a given industry, players could cooperate and compete at the same time without forming cartels. That is an experiment which is long overdue for governments in the modern world. But there are other things that also need to be harmonized. And from the point of view of the way that countries behave, the most important harmonization we all have to learn is the need to harmonize our domestic and our international responsibilities. And I'll finish my opening remarks on that point. This is a point which I sometimes refer to as the dual mandate. It always used to be that people in positions of power and authority had a simple single mandate. They were responsible for their own people and for their own slice of territory. And whatever they did that was good for their people and good for their territory was applauded, even if it involved harming other people or other territories, because that simply demonstrated how effective they were at fulfilling their single mandate. My argument is that in the world that we live today, our interconnected and interdependent, fully globalized world, we have a dual mandate. Everybody in a position of power and authority today is responsible for their own people, yes, and for every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether they like it or not. They are responsible for their own slice of territory, yes, and for every single square inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they shouldn't be in a position of power or authority, because that's the rule of governance in the 21st century.
Thank you, as always, Saksen Simon. Dr. J, we have you. Good morning. Can you share your opening remarks on the present of public diplomacy in times of COVID-19?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope you can hear me all right. Apologize, people being late, and then obviously such a global event, and we need to be very mindful of the time zones and be very exact. And for some reason, I just, on my calendar, I put it wrong, and I so apologize. So thank you so much for organizing and having me for this very timely discussion. So let me say very quickly in general about sort of public diplomacy in the context of the coronavirus crisis, but more specifically, because my understanding is our audience, many of them are in the business world, and I wanted to say a few things specifically related to sort of the public diplomacy implications in the context of, in this particular crisis, but actually, you know, in the larger context, in the ongoing global dynamics, in what ways public diplomacy is so very relevant, not only to our nation-state governments, obviously, but also to non-state actors of growing global consequence, including our private companies. So needless to say, the outbreak of this coronavirus will be remembered as one of the worst global crises in our modern history. By now, we all know very clearly the basic contours of what this crisis is all about. And as Simon was saying just a few minutes ago, unfortunately, international cooperation to diffuse and defeat such a crisis has been very elusive so far. And at the same time, as the world is watching, so every nation is fending basically for itself, but at the same time, because the world is watching, every country's reputation and credibility is also put through the test as we see how countries are managing this particular crisis. That this disruptive reality forces us to really think about what's the future of global affairs, which in many ways demands an even more nuanced approach to maintain a stable world, to maintain a stable marketplace, whereas a broader spectrum of our public is likely to succumb to the siren call of a resurgent nationalism. And these developments obviously are not new. The current pandemic will only exacerbate these trends. The pandemic doesn't alter the fundamental dynamics that we have been seeing that's underway in our global system. And what it does is it forces us to rethink in a narrow sense our public diplomacy practices, but also more broadly, what are the consequences of the global shifts, both in technology and in geopolitical dynamics, changing the ways how people see their own life worlds and see other countries. And in this particular case, as we talk about, you know, our private businesses, how consumers are going to see their brands and experience their brands, and how companies are going to develop their global presence, and what new capabilities they may need as a result of all of this. So I would like to sort of underscore two sort of trends and developments in this increasingly distributed global system. So one is for the private sector, certainly for governments as well. One is the disruption comes with the technology, and what the technological disruptions have done for us is that they leave us with no existing regulatory norms and tools to address a lot of the practices and also the implications, right? And so in this particular case, digital technology has geopolitical consequences as well. So the way I see it, they're mainly in three aspects. One is, of course, the data governance issue that we are all struggling with. The second is the future work. And the third is the concentration of power. So all of these issues, when no country or as a world now have a clear understanding of a path forward in terms of how do we put forth our regulatory framework and norms to guide the development of our technologies, right? So in the old days, the governments will come together and just sort of establish, these laws and regulations to guide the marketplace. But now we have companies and civil societies as well, right, equally involved in debating and in enacting these policies and all of that. So in many ways, companies are going to be also, on the front lines of this international policy arena, and with the government, with the non-stakeholders, with the other non-state stakeholders. And so then what kind of capability these companies would need in order for them to be an effective player? And because certainly all of these things matters to them, matters to their business models, right? Whether it's going to be viable or not going forward. So this transnational policy arena requires unprecedented international cooperation and cross-sector collaboration. And our current frameworks certainly have not caught up to the speed and scope of the change. And so our global policy making and our public engagement currently still sort of waiting to see what should be the strategies and should be the frameworks. So related to that is the geopolitical shifts. I already mentioned that technological innovation has geopolitical consequences, but technological innovation is so much connected with economic development these days. So if you look at the global economic growth, this is based on the McKinsey analysis. Over the next decade, much of the economic growth opportunities will lie in regional markets, including India, China, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And so with economic power, there comes the political power. So, right? So geopolitical economic terrain is shifting as countries and governments need to renegotiate expectations of one another. At the current moment, the tensions are rising. And so as businesses, when you operate in that kind of environment, it's a far more volatile environment, especially as regards to technological businesses, because technologies in general, they're kind of global instantaneously. It's not like you're making something here and then you're trying to roll it out in another country and then going and hopefully to a global marketplace. And even if it is not technology companies, but these days we all believe that every company is a tech company because you have to integrate some technology into your business process, and you are just like Facebook, right? You're just like Google. You have to face all these questions that I just laid out: future work, data governance, and the concentration of power. And so, how do you manage all these issues? And while at the same time, aside from these sets of issues, the new policy issues, I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, there is this resurgence of nationalism, national identity, and how does that may intersect with the international relations dynamics as our marketplace is so global, and so how do consumers respond to brands and companies who are perceived to have certain foreign connections or perceived to be associated with a particular country. And so on that front, there has been studies, analysis in an earlier era, which we have seen these consumer boycotts, and this and that based on where the company sort of is based or which country this company is from. But in this new age and in this very fluid global information environment, and we will see how all of this is going to unfold. So what I'm arguing is that our companies need to develop a certain set of new capabilities, specifically to develop more policy sensitive and a culturally sensitive engagement and communication. So that leads back to the public diplomacy discussion, which is the focus of today, that why that matters, because diplomacy and the public diplomacy as it has been practiced may provide a valuable framework for international actions or interactions by non-state actors as well. And so we can certainly look into and discuss like what exactly do you mean by what practices or what kind of mindset that's embodied in the practice of public diplomacy are valuable or relevant for companies going forward. So let me just stop here and
Thank you.
I look forward to
Thank you, Dr. J. Most of you, while I have been informally chatting with you, have evinced your view on how India has handled the pandemic, and we have a very responsible, powerful voice to represent what goes into, or rather what went into India responding to this pandemic, as well as the role that he sees public diplomacy will play vis-a-vis India and the globe today. Mr. Ram Madhav, if you can share your views, sir. So you have to unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sudarshan, and my namaskars to all the distinguished panelists and participants in this webinar. Mr. Sudarshan may excuse me, I'm not going to talk about the handling of coronavirus by the Indian government. I would rather focus on the topic of today's webinar. Public diplomacy has always been about national branding, as many speakers have pointed out. We in India also have been engaged in this public diplomacy activity for the last several decades. We have our diplomatic channels to engage in this activity, but increasingly, like just now Mr. Wang mentioned, we realize that the power and influence of non-state actors in making or breaking the image of a nation has to be appreciated and understood. The role of these non-state players on the in the global affairs has increased in the last few decades tremendously. Today, we no longer live in any bipolar or multipolar world. We actually live in a heteropolar world. Besides the traditional poles, we have multinational corporations, civil society groups, NGOs, radical and extremist groups, ethnic and religious organizations. There is an endless list of power players in the world today. They all have become very critical, very important players in the world, because for them, the national and sovereign boundaries simply do not matter. The added dimension to this heteropolarity is technology, especially the explosion of social media that has taken place in last couple of decades has actually completely changed the way we deal with the rest of the world. Communication has become easier today. It is simpler. It is cheaper. It has become very interactive. And most importantly, it has become youth-centric. In a way, if I'm permitted to put it this way, we are living in the era of the tyranny of real time. For the spokespersons, for those engaged in public diplomacy, it's a big challenge as the information dissemination is extremely faster and much more impactful than probably we have ever anticipated. There is this ancient saying of by the satirist Jonathan Swift, which is, I think, more relevant today. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. We are in India, we are ourselves a victim of this tyranny of real time. For example, this whole propaganda about non-existent Islamophobia in India is a test case, is a challenge for our public diplomacy practitioners. Friends, it is in this changed world scenario that we are talking about public diplomacy today. We have institutionalized public diplomacy over the decades. We today have think tanks, we today have cultural centers. In fact, we have lots of publications. Chinese have their Confucius centers, France has Alliance Française, we in India, we have developed ICCR centers all over the world. Public diplomacy has that way been institutionalized. And also, as very rightly pointed out by my previous speakers, bodies like ICC, one of the host organizations here, CII, FICCI, these trade bodies, they started playing an important role. I mean, you can't imagine you can't understate the influence of probably a Facebook of America or an Alibaba of China in the public diplomacy today. They have become important players in this whole public diplomacy activity in shaping the image of different countries. We in India have also experimented in last few decades, probably last few years, with the diaspora diplomacy. We have engaged or encouraged our diaspora also to play an important role in public diplomacy. But friends, these are all tools. The actual question is about the content. That is where this post-COVID or the COVID and its fallout will come into an important, becomes an important issue for us. I believe that the post-COVID world order is going to be very different from the one that we are living in today. As some of the speakers pointed out, countries are more likely to turn inwards and attempt at more self-reliance and less dependence on the world outside. We are already seeing the rise of authoritarianism in various forms in different countries. In fact, the new buzz is about a new Cold War. Interconnectedness, interdependence, cooperative development, which we generally categorize as globalization, they are all facing a new challenge today. And I have no doubt that the new scenario, post-COVID scenario, will throw up a new global agenda also. It will no longer be about security. It will no longer be about trade, no longer be about commerce alone. It's going to be about new agenda items like climate change, healthcare, high technology like artificial intelligence, liberal world order, rule-based world order. These are going to be the new global agenda. So it is here that the entire public diplomacy activity has to restructure itself, reorient itself, and restate itself. Let me just take probably 2 minutes to conclude my presentation. The public diplomacy institutions that we have developed over last, say, 5-6 decades face a two-pronged challenge today. One is to equip to cope with this new heteropolar world. We have to turn to these new tools in a big way. And two is, of course, as I mentioned, to reinvent ourselves to cater to the new global agenda. We had an ancient lawgiver in India by name Chanakya. One of the oldest scholars to highlight the importance of public diplomacy. In his treatise Arthashastra, he had talked about it. He used to say that nations should learn to listen in order to succeed in public diplomacy and nation branding. You should listen. Public diplomacy institutions have to probably become listening posts for nations besides just being transmitters. That calls for greater engagement with other countries at the level of scholars, public intellectuals, and institutions. We should talk more, but we also listen the most. Let me end. I thank Mr. Sudarshan for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir, for giving the Indian perspective. We do have questions coming in, but I request all of you to type in. I'm just going to go to all speakers once more. I know the only certainty now is uncertainty, but I request all speakers to throw some light on the future. Some of you have partly done that. Dr. J and Mr. Madhav has partly done that. But if you have to deep dive further, your experience in public diplomacy is for everyone to see. Before we go to the Q&A section, I request all of you watching to please type your questions in the Q&A box. We'll take it up accordingly. But for the speakers, each one of you, few minutes of your views on the future of public diplomacy in a post-COVID-19 era. Ambassador Karl Erik.
Yes, Sudarshan, thank you very much. Well, we might be in a paradigm shift. Many people are already asking themselves, will this be the end of globalization? Will this be the comeback of national decision-making? People are speaking, including in my country, Sweden, and in Germany, they are speaking about self-sufficiency in agriculture, in medicines, etc. In a way which I haven't heard in the last few decades, but it's coming now. Are we going to an era of protectionism? Or it might be that, like Simon hinted, it could be that one finds a kind of a compromise. The globalization remains, but it will be paralleled with a democratic nationalism for a good cause. There's an interesting professor, Yair Tamir, who wrote an interesting book about that. The inequalities in the world, for instance, can hardly be solved internationally, have to be solved by democratic vote inside each country. And we know that democracy has also a crisis. Somebody has already referred to this, but recent research meant that we have less than 50% democratic countries or governments in the world today. So that is, it's a rather sad development at which might not be better through this crisis. Another thing is, will large-scale tourism ever come back? Because tourism has become extremely important for poor countries. At the same time, as we know, it's bad for the environment because it's too much flying. But the question is, will it come back? Will business travel now in the future be replaced like we now with webinars or digital communication, or will that also come back? The question which is also close to my heart is whether the European Union, which has its slogan, the unity in diversity, will the European Union survive this crisis? Can the EU keep up with the United States and China in the future? Because we have a very turbulent situation right now with a kind of trade war around the corner. There is another risk which might follow as a direct cause of this crisis, that income and fortune gaps grow even more. Risk that poverty will be the main heritage of the corona crisis. But the chances for improvement or for restoration are also there. There is a big chance opening up now for taking a good grip on the climate issues, less unnecessary food transportation, for instance, and there is a good chance for international cooperation in this field. And in the health sector, we are all looking at India, of course, which is a very strong actor in this field. There's another chance that you take this opportunity to improve equality and justice within the nations, but that has to be done nationally. But between the nations, there is a chance that through the United Nations, we try to establish better equality and justice between the nations. That is a role for the United Nations, of course. And there is also a chance to strengthening the United Nations, which has had some rather difficult years. A lot of credibility has been lost, etc. Intergovernmentalism, I would call this, because in the last 40 years with globalizations, governments have not been able to solve so many problems together. That has been left over to very many other parts of the society. Take the raw material agreements, for instance, where many poor countries have been suffering since there is not a raw material agreement anymore. And for me, finally, there is for us European people in the European culture, we are very anxious. Can individual artists come back at all? Or there is a risk that poverty will be the main heritage for that the cultural institutions cannot be saved in a near future? Or is global business just coming back as usual? Global business as usual? I doubt that. I think it will be a lot of changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Simon, your views on the future?
Let me be quite specific here. One of the questions about the future, which has been circulating a great deal in public diplomacy circles and amongst governments, is which countries are going to actually benefit in image terms from the pandemic, and specifically from the ways in which they've managed to cope with the pandemic. And a lot of people have asserted that the ones who've managed it best, the ones who've had the fewest casualties, the ones who've been most effective in organizing rapid lockdowns, will somehow reap an image benefit as a result of this. And the rest of the world will admire them more than they have. And that as a consequence of this, there'll be some kind of enormous reshuffle of the most admired countries on earth. I really doubt it. This is not my experience of how national images work. And I have a number of reasons for saying this. The first one is that most people around the world are very, very not interested in what other countries do at home. The vast majority of people pay very little attention to international media. Survey after survey has shown this. And the vast majority of people, particularly during this crisis, are so focused on their own domestic problems that they're not really looking very hard at what other countries are doing. And the idea that our whole worldview might change and we'll come out of this suddenly deciding that Taiwan is the most admirable country on earth simply because of how well it's handled the coronavirus seems very unlikely for that reason. Now, it's certainly true that a number of countries have been deliberately exercising coronavirus diplomacy. They've been sending plane loads of masks to certain countries in order to take advantage, presumably, of the goodwill that they hope this will generate. I think that also won't work. It won't work for two reasons. A, because, as I said earlier, we've all lost the ability to change our minds. And a gesture like that is too easy to question. If you don't like the country that's doing it, you're not going to suddenly say, oh my goodness, I was wrong about that country. They're wonderful because they're giving us face masks. People don't behave like that. What they'll say is, yes, now they're even trying to buy our approval by sending us secondhand face masks that probably don't work. That's the way people respond. So it's not going to change anybody's minds. And anyway, the only way that you change people's minds about other countries is by persisting in new behaviors over decades and generations, not with a one-off generous stunt. That just doesn't make any difference at all. Back in 2012 or so, I decided I was going to do a thorough analysis of all the data that I'd collected in the previous 10 or so years of the Nation Brands Index, which is a survey that I've been running every year since 2005. It's a big international poll of general populations in 20 to 38 different countries, measuring their perceptions of other countries. And the analysis that I performed on this database, which by 2012 had reached more than 1 billion data points, was simply to find out what is it that improves the images of countries? What is it that makes people admire country A more than country B? I knew that it wasn't propaganda, because over the years, there'd been absolutely no correlation between the amount of self-promotion that countries do and their images. It simply doesn't work. Spending a lot of money on logos and slogans and PR campaigns demonstrably does not move the needle on any country's international image. If that were possible, Karl Erik and I today would be living in the Third Reich or the European, instead of the European Union. Well, you're still living in the European Union, Karl Erik. I'm sadly not anymore, but you get my point. Almost nobody understood nation branding better than Goebbels or Stalin from that point of view. We'd probably still be living in the Soviet Union if international propaganda of this sort were possible. If it were possible to force international public opinion to change its mind about countries. Luckily, it's not. You just can't. And so I think it's as I say, really very unlikely that the world order, the ranking of admired countries, is going to change as a result of coronavirus. The countries that were despised beforehand, people will find reasons to despise them even more afterwards, and the countries that they loved, they'll find even more reasons to love them afterwards. What just might change, I think, however, and this is going back to what I was saying before, if the people who care about these things seize the advantage and do something about it, is to use coronavirus as the illustration of an extremely important point, which is it has proved that we human beings have no particular dispensation to survive. Our very existence can be threatened. And this, in a sense, was the realization that perhaps was missing from the climate change debate up until this point. I think we all had enormous difficulty imagining the idea that there could be a planet without us, that we could somehow no longer exist. I think this has probably been true of every civilization since the dawn of humanity. What coronavirus has done is that it's showed us that distinct possibility that we have no particular right to be here and we could be snuffed out at any point. I think that's a valuable thing to have learned, and I think it will be very, very useful in the discussions about climate change and the other global challenges as we move forwards.
Dr. J, your thoughts?
So this is not as much a prognosis than my suggestions to the practice. I have 4 suggestions. The first one is what I would call a take a network view. The suggestion is mostly more on the functional aspect of this practice. What that means is that, as speakers earlier have already pointed out, going forward, we're looking at a new set of global agenda. And through this particular crisis, we already realized, even we don't have the kind of a collaboration that's needed, that trust between peoples and societies is the foundation for us to address any of these global threats and challenges in the future. So how do we build that kind of a trust? But public diplomacy, that's what public diplomacy is, the purpose of public diplomacy is all about, right? On behalf of a nation state. So it's about relationship building. However, in this age of, with all the digital technology, we need to look at this from what I would call a network perspective. And so it's not so much about messaging, imparting messages. Of course, we still need to impart messages. We still need to share, our messages. But it's really taking a much harder look at what kind of a network we are building, and what does the network actually mean, and what is the value of such a network, and in ways to build relationships. And so one of the ways is to apply social network analysis, analytical tools to map out a lot of these networks. I like to use the example, for instance, many countries, I think most countries, are involved in some shape and form cultural exchanges or international exchange. And some have done this. In the case of the United States, we have been doing this for a long, long time, very formalized programs, our flagship programs like Fulbright, International Leadership Visitor Program. So the question then becomes this: over decades, we do have a network, right, of alumni, past participants. But what's the value of that network, right? Aside from we know who they are, where they are, and so I am suggesting that we need to apply more advanced tools to help us better understand what network actually means for our public diplomacy work, in addition to just talking about making sure, foreign publics or even our domestic publics now have a greater understanding of whatever the policies are, but the mechanism to do that is actually through these networks. The second thing I wanted to suggest is that we need to figure out a way to integrate the digital and the physical aspect of our work. So just as in people's everyday life, our digital life interacts ever more with the physical realm. And I think the coronavirus episodes has made it very apparent to us that despite of the ease of all these communication tools, we also know something precious is missing when we are removed from our physical environment. And there will come a day when we can go back to our face-to-face international exchange programs And so now we need to think about how do we integrate those two aspects. While physical presence still is, to me, it's elemental as for humans at this point in terms of communication. And but the digital tools certainly provide very powerful capabilities for us. And then we need to figure out how do we combine these tools and to move our practice forward. And then the third thing I would say is about expanding what we call the city diplomacy, because there's global agenda items mentioned earlier, for instance, climate change, and even probably, you know, our public health issues going forward requires this global response. And then the way how we are organized now, perhaps even it is more effective at the city level. We are already seeing you know, cities moving very proactively on climate change issues, and through its own network, sharing practices and knowledges, sharing resources, forging collaborations and partnerships, and demonstrating solidarity and a sense of community. Our nation state you know, level actors, of course, they will continue to be important, but we do face this reality of the political gridlocks, and we do face the reality of the bureaucratic gridlocks that we have seen. And these global threats and challenges cannot wait for our, you know, national actors to work these things out. And so at the local level, at the city level, we need to provide the mechanisms to generate this kind of goodwill, to generate that kind of reciprocity that's fundamental to trust that we were talking about earlier for relationship building, for global challenges. But equally important, you know, we talked about this notion about the rising nationalism and countries turning inward. Perhaps our citizens and local communities need to and must understand the necessity of their own communities' international engagement. And through that, they may see that their nation international engagement to advance their interests and to advance national security is critical for them. And I think that we have been struggling, I'm saying more from the US perspective, how do we sort of ensure our citizens have appreciation, that kind of a level of support for our foreign policy community, the diplomatic community, and to the level that's really demanded, needed now as we, you know, negotiate or advance international policies. And so perhaps at the city's level, we can do a lot more and to ensure our citizens are more engaged and have a more global mindset. Lastly, I also think it's very important. This is not talking about future, actually we should do it now, which is invest in public diplomacy, reskilling and capability building, because we know that, you know, this practice fundamentally is communication centric, and our communication tools, the communication landscape has fundamentally changed. And so how do we, you know, utilize whether it's these new tools to manage our communication? And it's not just about adopting tools, it is about how do we rethink our organizational process to ensure that this type of engagement is both effective and efficient going forward. But that will require lots of investment in upskilling and retraining, reskilling of our professionals going forward. And this will be an ongoing process. And there is no, because there is no delay in this type of investment, because you need to invest in them anyways. If it's not today, you need to do that 2 years or 3 years down the road. And probably it's a better idea for you to invest now so that you can, you know, get a head start on all of these and to integrate that into your organizational processes.
Thank you, Dr. J. Mr. Madhav, your thoughts on the future?
Yes, other than whatever I have said in my opening comments, I have just one additional point to make. As I said, the global agenda will undergo a major shift. We have to, the public diplomacy discourse has to reorient itself to the new agenda. While doing so, I would like to highlight one major lacuna in the discourse, That is, that we have focused our discourse too much on power. We talk about soft power, we talk about hard power. The discourse in public diplomacy circles also has all along been, in the last few decades, more centered around power. It's a power discourse. Can this be shifted to value discourse? Why I'm saying this is, with all this great discussion, hard power and soft power of nations and all that, thanks to Joseph Nye, we have failed to produce one great social political philosopher of the ranks of probably a Marx or a Kant in last 50 years. It is time we turned this discourse, we shifted this discourse to value-centric and, most importantly, human-centric. The future of the public discourse should be human-centric. In whichever sector we are talking about, it has to be human-centric and value-centric discourse.
Thank you, sir. I understand I've taken a lot of time of all of you. I'll just pose one question to each of you, and I request all of you to answer. First question for Mr. Madhav. How do you think India has recently put out the discourse of being self-sufficient? How do you see India balancing between being self-sufficient and also enabling global and regional outreach in a post-COVID world?
Look, the word we used was Atmanirbhar. It is self-reliance. Self-reliance in material terms and global in value terms. We have all along been, I mean, if you look at the last 5 years, India has made special efforts to carry this, what I highlighted in my last point, the value-centric discourse, the human-centric discourse to the world. That's why we took yoga to the global platform. We took meditation to the global platform. Today, when we are majorly afflicted with this pandemic, the discourse that we are taking before the world is it enough to think in terms of disease management, or we have to probably think in terms of life management so that diseases cannot really reach us, hit at us. So in that sense, you know, knowledge systems like Ayurveda, other indigenous systems of medicine, these also become an important part. But bottom line is, India will continue to play a role in all those areas which are value-centric. That's why I said new agenda will be about environment change, about climate change. It's a value proposition. It's about healthcare, a value proposition. It's about technology, highly value proposition area. Which technologies you want, which you do not want, which you should encourage, you should not encourage. In all these new areas, India has an important role to contribute as a country focused on human-centric development and value-centric life.
Fascinating. Human-centric values and technology will be the way forward. Ambassador Karl Erik, a question for you. How much focus must the international community lay on cultural integration in future for sustainability of humanity via public diplomacy?
I think the world has to put much focus on that, and I see perhaps a risk and a chance here. There is a risk that the focus on the national solutions, which we are witnessing right now, takes away the attention from the need to integrate other cultures with each other in the countries. I'm speaking mainly from the European experience here. The chance, on the other hand, is of course that the crisis will perhaps open new possibilities of thinking in new terms, and not forgetting, of course, the fact that there is a very big amount of public money now spent on saving economy, saving industry, saving cultural institutions, saving educational institutions, and so on. And in this connection, perhaps a little bit of the, shall we say, the drama of integration and of migration is disappearing, and a certain normality might come by itself by the, let's say, integrated groups in countries like Germany or Sweden and France. They would previously have been considered foreigners who shouldn't be there to take our jobs, but there is a chance that with the new situation after the corona crisis, that they are just seen that our brothers and sisters who have also gone through this whole crisis. So let's do the best together.
Thank you. Simon, a question for you. The onset of pandemic has seen a lot of trust deficiency. In this situation, how should countries reinforce trust?
Well, thank you for saving the hardest question for me. I think the restoration of trust in the public sector is one of the biggest challenges facing us at the moment. One of the things that politicians the world over has succeeded in doing over the last 30 or 40 years is comprehensively disgracing themselves. The diminishing of trust in administrations and governments is one of the biggest problems we face at the moment. And I think that we probably need to address that by changing the way that we find our politicians. And in order to do that, we probably have to change the incentives that lead people to become politicians. Somehow or other, we have to get the better people into government. And one of the biggest problems we've got at the moment is the lack of trust in governments. And the biggest part of that problem is the fact that governments don't have the trust because, frankly, they don't deserve it. Karl Erik spoke very eloquently right at the beginning about the harm that globalization has done to the environment and to social justice and to income equality and all of these other issues. It has to be said that globalization has only been able to do this damage by being in partnership with governments who have simply failed to anticipate the damage that globalization could and would inevitably do. So I don't know the full answer, and it's another very much longer discussion, but we have to have a very, very serious think about where and how we recruit our politicians from in the future, what sort of people they are, what motivates them to become politicians, how we engage the public much more in the process of policy making, how we eliminate this now finished idea of party politics, because that's not doing us any favors at all, how people can participate in the daily policy making decisions, and how we can get some of those excellent people who at the moment, quite understandably, are going into business to go into politics instead. The whole game needs to be reinvented. There seems little doubt about that.
Thank you, Simon. One question for you, Dr. J. Do you see, as you have already seen in the recent past, there have been digital summits happening, G20 from an Indian point of view, SAARC, so on and so forth. Do you see relations between countries getting affected adversely or turn for the good in times of digital diplomacy?
The one thing that we need to have a better understanding based on our current digital outreach is that we need to better understand sort of the underlying psychological motivations of people. Actually, in a way, it comes to the very kind of fundamental basic question that we have always asked in the offline world. It's the same. And then we just haven't developed a good understanding of the psychological underpinnings of people's online behavior. So what I mean is that currently what we are looking at is we're looking at a lot of behavioral data, which is available for us because we can track how many people, follow you and like you or, retweeted you and that kind of a thing. So that's all behavioral data. Of course, that's very important for us to know, to know like how people are behaving online or whatever the comments people are saying and all of that. But then the most important question is just going beyond that is like, so why people are behaving like that, saying like things like that, right? So I just use use an example to show this. For instance, when we started to realize that we need to counter disinformation, so there's a lot of false information stuff people or governments put it out deliberately to misinform people, to confuse people. And so I thought naively at the very beginning that, oh, we should just provide people with the truth, the facts, and that people are not going to spread that kind of false information. Well, that's a misunderstanding of the basic psychological underpinning of why people, are spreading information. Or people are spreading information because it's not so much whether how truthful the information is. They want to spread because they want people, to share, and they want more people to follow them. And so whatever the outrageous things that's out there, put it out there, true or not true, it's some consideration, but may not be their main consideration. So when you understand that kind of a psychological motivation behind people's online digital behavior, and then that will help us to do better digital outreach in public diplomacy. And then currently, I think we're starting to get a better grasp at this. But we still need to, sometimes there's also, it requires some time and for us to kind of, to understand, what's actually happening out there. And, but anyway, so yeah, I'm sure that we need to better understand the psychological underpinnings of people's online behavior as it relates to public diplomacy work.
Thank you. We've had close to 90 minutes of a fascinating, insightful, and cerebral discussion. I also realize that this topic needs perhaps a 1 or 2 day conference, in a sense, to perhaps deep dive into some of the archival points that all of you have pointed out while making your presentation, as well as answering questions. I'd also assured all of you, especially those from outside India joining the distinguished speakers, that we'll soon invite you to India when we have our conference. Of course, the only regret is that this discussion couldn't happen in physical presence. So when the situation is better, we will be inviting all of you to India. May I request Mrs. Lalitha Kumaramangalam, Director of India Foundation and former chairperson of the National Commission for Women in India, to deliver the vote of thanks.
First of all, thank you to Sudarshan for inviting me to this meeting. This is a fairly new topic for me, so it was both an honor and a delight for me to listen to so many experts. Thank you all for taking the time to come back to meet us and to work again with the Center for Soft Power. I'm very grateful on behalf of India Foundation. And of course, also thank you to Madhav ji. He's always been the force behind India Foundation. Without his encouragement, most of our work would fall flat on its face. So thank you all once again. And like Sudarshan ji just said, we all look forward to meeting each other in physical space, not just over the internet. And let's hope that that comes round as soon as possible. Thank you all again very, very much.
And we must not forget to thank the Indian Chamber of Commerce, based in the east of India. Every participant and all the organizations that they represent. And I think the Indian Chamber of Commerce has been a supporter of the Center for Soft Power for a long time. Yes. So to you, of course, our special thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all of you. Namaste.
Bye.